Thank you, everyone. I'm delighted to join you here for this diversity talk, and I'm particularly thrilled that you have some interest. I never know when the headline is geriatrics, how many people are actually going to show up in the audience. So it's nice to see a lot of people here. That gives my heart, an extra thump in it today. Makes me feel good that you are interested in something that I am really, really super passionate about. I should start by saying that I am not a particularly formal person. So the more engaging this discussion is, the better. I have slides prepared, but we can go completely rogue if that's what you're all down for. So feel free to jump in, throw out thoughts, comments, ask questions, whatever, as we go along, and it won't rattle me one bit. So these are the objectives that I hope we'll get to cover in the next 40 or so minutes. So first of all, I want you to think a bit about what it's like to be an older adult in our society. What challenges do we face in our environment? And how have we done as a country in thinking about making accommodations for those challenges? How much does that show what we embrace as a country? What's sort of the sociology around that? And finally, of course, we want to think about, well, how does that impact us in the healthcare field? How do what we value as Americans help us make decisions and treatment options available to patients as they age in the healthcare field? So I'm hoping that by the end of the discussion, you'll leave here saying, I'm thinking about aging a little bit differently. I'm thinking about how it impacts my job just a little bit differently, and you're observing more as you go through the day. So I broke this up into really 3 parts. We'll first talk about the ecology of aging and how aging and the environment interact. Then we're going to spend a bulk of the time talking about Americanism and how this relates to what we value or don't value about aging and what it means to you individually and what you've observed and experienced and hope for as you get older. And then finally, of course, we'll touch on some of the demographics related to the healthcare sector. So what percent of the population is getting older, what diseases they suffer from, and those sorts of things. And think a bit about what does that mean for treatment options. So this was a quote by Robert Lucci that comes to mind very, very often. I think it's an occupational hazard being a geriatrician, that every time I travel or I'm getting on or off a train, I always think about how would an older person, that train just lurched. How would someone with bad balance manage that? Or look at what small font there is in this restaurant. How does an older person ever know what to order? They must have to just pick something or save face, So it's sort of I'm constantly observing how our environment interacts with the aging process. And it is truly an uneasy truce, and I will say the environment always wins. So the environment is often used as a metaphor for the aging process. Poets in particular do this. They talk about, birth as the dawning of the light, and you go through your life, and death is the clouds coming, the nightfall, the stars coming out, the closing of the day. The seasons of the year are often referred to when speaking about the life cycle, where winter comes inevitably. Phases of fire, so there's the roaring fire and then the last embers that fade, and it gives you this sense of a continuity. So let's do an observation about man versus environment, in this case, woman versus environment. And this was actually a video that I couldn't get to work, and it's a very long video anyhow, because part of the story is that she moves very slowly. This is one of my patients trying to get into her home in Dundalk. And I want you to shout out, what do you observe about this picture?
The walker's wider than the sidewalk.
The walker's wider than the sidewalk, right? So she's not going to get that walker up the stairs, right? Or if she did, heaven forbid, if she was trying to lift it up.
Steep steps.
Yeah, those are not regulation steps. This was a house that was built long ago.
And there's not even handrails.
Okay, no handrails. You're getting sharper and sharper. You're thinking like a geriatrician now. I love it. Anything else you notice about her? The door? The door opens this way. So she has to back down the stairs to open that door, right? Anything else?
The mailbox doesn't look very easy for her to get into either.
Right, so she's got to stand on the step and reach around the corner there. You can't quite see it very sharply, but she's carrying a purse that's got her keys and her cell phone and everything in there. So somehow she's going to get to these stairs very slowly. She's stooped over, right? moving very slowly. She's going to leave her walker behind. She's going to tempt fate, carrying her purse, going up steep stairs without a handrail. She's going to fish and find her keys, open the door, back down the stairs, and then sweep around and get in. It's one of the most frightening things I'd ever seen. This is a lady that I usually see in the office, and you'd have no sense of this, really. You just see her sitting in a chair, and her wheelchair or her walker is there beside her. But she goes through this every single time she needs to leave her house. Every single time you want to set up for an echocardiogram because you heard a heart murmur, she's going to tempt fate in and out to go get that echocardiogram. And that's just her doorway. That's just her entranceway. I mean, the home itself was full of hazards. I think as young people, we don't really think about this. But once you start becoming aware, you start noticing that we have done, as a country, a terrible job in making accommodations for the elderly in our environment. If I were giving us a grade, I'd say Americans are an F. Okay, well, how did we get there? Why aren't we doing a better job than this? So this goes, the field of geriatrics goes back to about the 1950s, was the first time this entered the medical lexicon. And, that was a time we were post-World War II era. We're full of, optimism and faith and excitement about the future. And aging was identified as a disease to be conquered. This is where our society took a major turn in how we thought about older individuals. So the first issue of the Journal of the American Geriatric Society, our premier medical journal, was published in 1953. And there were articles called things like the aging syndrome, right? So they're making it a disease, a syndrome to have aging. And in fact, in the journal, they said the ultimate aim of gerontology, or the study of aging, is perfection in maintaining the entire human ecology at its full peak of youthful vigor. So aging is something to be avoided, to be sorry for, to try and rage against. This was one of the American Geriatric Society meetings, one of our presenters standing up there. Still not true. So aging has been, for a long time, seen as a disease and very, very un-American. This is a quote that was taken from Kate Scannell, who's a physician, a primary care physician. And she describes a patient encounter that I have had very similar encounters to many times over. So she's talking about a woman that she's going to go in the room to see, and she's looking through a chart, and she really has no major health issues. And she walks in the room, and the woman's on the exam table kind of all twisted up like a pretzel, doing a yoga pose. And when the doctor walks in, she says to Dr. Scannell, I'm really bothered that I'm not as flexible as I used to be. I need to get to the bottom of this. You need to fix this now. Aging is un-American. So the quote from this article I'm going to read to you. Accepting the reality of aging may be uniquely problematic in the United States because aging is so downright un-American. We are engorged with a fierce national narrative about our individual freedom and independence, our self-sufficiency, our autonomy, our perennial powers to reinvent ourselves, a narrative that aging frequently and potently dispels. When this fiction collapses, we find ourselves stranded with uncertain personal and cultural identities. So I want to do a little audience participation just for a couple minutes. I'm going to ask you to think about and discuss these with the person sitting next to you, if you would, please. I will also ask you, so that we stay on schedule, when I call time out, that you participate with that too, and turn your attention back up here so that we can keep things right on schedule. So first, I want you to each spend a minute talking about, I want you to think of an older person from movies or TV shows that you watch. And first, I want you to talk about whether it was easy or hard for you to think of that person, and describe what that person is like and how they're portrayed. After a couple minutes, I'll ask you to switch and move on to the second question, which is to think about older people that you might work with, or someone in your family, or a neighbor. Is it easier or harder to find those examples? And what are those people like? Do they fit the stereotypes? Are they different from the stereotypes? And then we'll debrief as a group. So, ready, go. First question, I'll give you a couple minutes. All right, let's go ahead and regroup. Oh, you're such a good group. You're so obedient. I love it. Thank you. Thank you all so much. Good. So let's talk about that for a minute. So first, let's talk about what you discussed about how the media portrays older adults. Who can throw out some key words that kind of came up in your discussions?
Senile.
Senile.
Yeah, I actually think the media does a good job of portraying.
Oh, good. Good.
They're iconic, heroes.
Good. There are some heroes now. I love the movie Up. I'm a big fan. Yeah.
We said recently some of the movies they're portrayed as vigorous. There was one with Morgan Freeman
Right.
and two other guys, they were robbing banks.
Exactly.
One older, and they were more elderly than 65-ish, so we
Yeah.
feel like it's progressed a little with the acceptance of older actors, and
Yes.
more movies are coming out with older actors.
But it's
and
definitely
versus
more
the-
men.
There's more men.
We still have gender issues.
And that's the first thing that came to my mind. She's
Yes.
still doing television, she's doing different shows, and she's 90 something, I believe. And we see her in that light, but I wonder behind the scenes how much she's listening to things she actually did.
I love
And we
that.
were having trouble coming up with older adults that are in wheelchairs in movies,
Right.
or going through dementia in movies,
Yeah.
or family situations that are on the declining side as opposed to vigorous
Yeah.
side.
Yeah. You probably didn't see any movies with my patient or someone like my patient, right? Struggling to get in the house and that sort of thing. Good. All right. So it seems like there's a general theme, like, okay, senile, debilitated, so forth. Less of them probably than younger people, but a trend. We're seeing a positive trend. There's a movement towards some more positive portrayals of healthy, vigorous people. And Betty White is just an exception who's been around for, 90 whatever years, but she's awesome, and we need more Betty White. How about your experiences with older people in your lives? Were they similar to what you see portrayed by our media? Were they different?
Like yes and no.
Okay.
I've had grandmothers who suffered from dementia and eventually had to go in nursing homes. But then I have a neighbor who's literally 90 and walks 3 or 4 miles a day. He lives on his own, has his full mind. So I'd say it varies. I've seen both sides.
Yeah. And that's actually the biggest point I want to make, is that the aging process is incredibly heterogeneous. So for one person can have a terribly demented mind, but physically be great. And another older person can be physically pretty impaired, but their mind is perfectly sharp. And there's people, my colleague Buck Greeno, who ran the Baltimore Marathon on our marathon team a couple of years ago. He's still working full time. He's 87, 88 years old, still runs. He puts all of us to shame with his athleticism. So the elderly population is incredibly diverse, physically, demographically, socially, you name it. So big heterogeneity in the elderly population. And I don't think that's always the way it's portrayed in media, although I will agree they're doing better in the last few years. Good. All right, so that's the thoughts around Americanism. We'll get back to that when we get to healthcare and how Americanism can impact healthcare. But I wanted to move into Act 2 and talk a little bit about just kind of basics about aging in our population. Probably most of you are familiar with these statistics and know that our population is aging dramatically. So these are data for people over the age of 65, over the age of 85 and over, from 1900 all the way up to projections to 2060. So we're closer to here right now. And what percent of the population they represent. So it shoots way up and is expected to keep going. I'm sorry, this isn't percent. This is in absolute numbers, in millions. But the percent also happens to go up. Yeah, 1,000,000%. Run. So both groups are expected to increase dramatically in the coming years and already are on this steep uptick. This is when we break this down by looking at ethnic groups, and these are by census data, so how people self-report their ethnicity. If they have two different boxes, the solid blue is what we measured in 2014 and what is projected for 2016. What you can see is that over time, this group will become ethnically more diverse as well. The numbers of non-Hispanic whites will be down to 55%, and other groups will all increase to adjust for that. Now, we're terrible at predicting survival in healthcare. This is one of the things that doctors are famously rotten at, is guessing how long someone has to live. It's often the first question your patients ask you when you give them a new diagnosis is, how long do I have? And it's always, I'm really, really sorry, don't know. And part of that is because people now die from chronic diseases rather than from cancers quickly, although they still die from cancer, or a heart attack that took them quickly, or a pneumonia that took them quickly. We've done so great in managing acute episodes of healthcare crises, and people survive long enough then that they can develop these chronic diseases, and those are hard. People fade away from those rather than dying quite suddenly. But most of us tend to underestimate survival. So if you ask me, or if I asked you rather, how long do you think an 85-year-old woman who's in the most fit quartile of her functional status, so maybe your neighbor, for example, you might be surprised to know her life expectancy, she's got another 9.6 years, probably. That's pretty good. She's 85, and she's expected to live almost another decade if she's in that functional status. So there's a difference between men and women, but overall, it's a little bit more positive than you might have guessed. And I find these tables actually pretty helpful when I'm talking to patients and thinking about where they fall out. So speaking of life expectancy is increasing for men and women of all races, but not exactly at the same rate. So if you look way back to 1980s, these lines, so let's just look at the data for people over the age of 65. The order is always the same. White women, age 65, black or African American women, age 65. So women do better than men. White women do better than black women. For men, white men do better than black men. And they're pretty spread out here. Women and men are very different here. These lines all get closer, although the slope of this line, black men over the age of 65, isn't quite as steep for reasons we don't entirely understand, and I have a whole lot of theories about that, and I'm sure you do as well. But all of the races are increasing some. So survival is increasing for some better than others, and there's clearly an inequity there that is not completely explained. These are what people die of, and so I think this is just fascinating to look at heart disease. Still the number one cause of death, but probably not for too much longer at the rate we're going. Cancer is actually on the rise, but it's starting to decline just a tiny bit too. And these chronic diseases, although still low compared to cancer and heart disease, are increasing, particularly if you pick out Alzheimer's disease, which is this kind of brownish line. You can see it was almost unmeasurable before, and very ever so slightly increasing. And as people live longer and longer, that line's expected to continue to increase, at least until we come up with a cure for Alzheimer's disease. Cross our fingers. Okay. And these are just a description of the chronic health conditions that older individuals that you and I might encounter in the healthcare system have. So it's different for men versus women. So men are the dark bars, women are the lighter bars. You see the arthritis is remarkably common. Most people, as they get older, will develop some arthritis. It usually starts in your 40s. I've got it in my thumbs already in my 50s. Hypertension is also remarkably common, and you see a range of other diseases: bronchitis, cancer, diabetes, stroke, and heart disease. All right, so let's get back to the fun part then. Now we have a sense of who the population is. We have a sense of a little bit about what we value as Americans. Has anybody recently gone to a grocery store or a drugstore to buy moisturizer? It's unbelievable, right? Like you just want like some moisturizer. There's anti-aging, there's retinol, there's vitamin C, there's stuff for small, fine lines, there's stuff for big lines, there's stuff for uneven color, there's all this youthful glow. I just want something for like dewy-faced 50-year-old lady. But I guess that doesn't work in the market. But that's all you want is just like a little moisture, right? This is a big, big business now. So $50 billion a year are spent on over-the-counter anti-aging products. So that doesn't count Botox and plastic surgeries and facelifts and so on and so forth. Just the stuff you buy at the drugstore is a huge, huge industry because we all want so desperately to look younger. A lot of money spent in long-term care. We have a big gap in our healthcare system where people who are getting increasingly debilitated don't have the ability to stay in their home independently, and we don't have the ability to help them in their home. There's not good financing for an aide to come in or someone to clean the house or just kind of basic help with their activities of daily living. So they often end up in long-term care, which is tremendously expensive because as a society, we haven't invested in that very much. So this is a great marketing opportunity. There's a wonderful synergy between the fear of aging and treating aging as a disease and everyone's willingness to pay a lot of money for it. Now I want to tell you a story about Dr. William DeBakey. Does anybody know the name Dr. DeBakey? Yeah, some people. Yeah, probably the most famous surgeon of our time. He's died now. He was a heart surgeon who operated into his late 90s. I mean, he was an amazing physical specimen, cognitively sharp as could be. He was still traveling the country, giving talks. He invented a surgery that saved the lives of people who were having dissecting aortic aneurysms. Normally, that's a fatal condition. And he developed techniques to go in and quickly repair with a DeBakey operation. And so people from around the world would often fly to Texas so that Dr. DeBakey could do his surgery. And sometimes, even as he got very, very old, he maybe was just stepping in at the last minute and putting a stitch in it, but at least you could say my DeBakey surgery was actually done by Dr. DeBakey. Very, very famous individual. So one day, when he was 97 and still working, he went into the hospital. He was teaching some surgical residents. He went home midday, and he was preparing a talk that he was going to be giving. He was working in his den. And as he sat there preparing his talk, suddenly he got this feeling in his chest, this deep tearing sensation that went right straight to his back. He was having a classic aortic dissection, and he knew it. He said, aha, I know exactly what this is, and I know exactly what needs to be done for it. So he thought about it, and then he went and laid down on the couch. He didn't call 911, didn't go to the hospital. A couple hours later, his wife came home and said, what are you doing? It wasn't like him to be laying on the couch, not working. And he reluctantly told her what was going on, that he was pretty certain he was having a dissecting aneurysm and that he chose not to go to the hospital, that he wanted to be at home. She argued with him. She got a friend to come talk to him. They finally cajoled him into going to the hospital, which he did do, and he was in the intensive care unit. And still in the intensive care unit, when they offered him surgery to repair his aneurysm, multiple times he said, no, I'm 97 years old. I've lived a full life. I know what's going to happen, and I don't want to go through surgery. But then he became unconscious. And his wife said, you're killing Dr. DeBakey if you don't do this surgery. I insist you operate on him now. He can't speak for himself. I'm his healthcare agent. I'm speaking on his behalf. I believe this is what he would have wanted. They called in an ethics consult, and ultimately they decided to go with the wife and do the surgery. So he went through the procedure, had his heart repaired. He was in the hospital a prolonged period and rehab a prolonged period, racked up over $1 million in healthcare costs, and ultimately was able to go back home, but was extremely debilitated. He was in a motorized wheelchair, just was a shadow of his former self. So about a year after all of that, after he recovered and went home, he was interviewed and asked, well, Dr. DeBakey, what do you think about the fact that you had this surgery? What do you think he said? You would think so, but for reasons that are inexplicable to me, other than he loves his wife very much, he said, I'm grateful they did it. I'm glad they did it. I'm glad I went through it. Look at me now. I'm able to get around. Thank heavens for the miracle that is medicine. Thank heavens for that surgery that I discovered. So what do you think about that?
I think it's partially natural. I mean, like, people do just want to live. You know,
Sure.
like, he did make that decision, but then he, then the reality of it was on his wife when he was really dying, and
Right.
I don't know, I think it is a natural kind of response to want to live.
I think that's true. I think that there's a widespread, deeply held desire not to be dead. And that the strength of your conviction gets even stronger the closer you are to death for most people. It's very easy in the abstract to say, oh, I would never want to live like that. Or if this happens to me, don't put me on all those machines. That sounds inhuman. But if we're talking about today, like in the next hour, do you mean you're going to put me on the machine? Well, maybe just for a little bit. The finality of all can kind of change when you're faced with reality.
I actually have a different perspective on
Yeah.
it because I'm 62 and I'm retiring next month. And but my decisions that I would make based with some lifelong things are different now than they would have been that 20 years ago. I watched my grandfather who had cancer and it recurred, and when he was given the treatment options, one of which was do nothing, he said the sooner the better, and he was gone within 24 hours. But it was his decision, and we honored that.
Yeah, I think these decisions are highly personal is the point. And that it's not so shocking when people change their mind, though. It depends on what your experience has been and your value set. Some people say, life at all costs. Some people say, gosh, I watched my wife suffer. And it was miserable, and she died laying in diarrhea and vomit. And I don't think that's dignified. I don't want it for me. No thank you on that chemo. And, I think that's a valid choice as well. Someone else had a thought. Yeah.
So I wonder if the reason he said what he did at the end is because he was thinking about it would be better for his wife if she didn't have to deal with the surgery and the post-op, and he knew what the percentages and potential was for what might happen post-op, and he might have thought that it would be easier for his wife if he just didn't do anything. But once his wife made the decision, that he was perfectly fine to be able to continue to live his life.
Yeah, again, we don't really know what I'm not holding out any information. I don't know any more information than that about why he made the decisions he did, why he first said he didn't and made it very clear he didn't want the surgery, and then later said, thank goodness they did it.
But isn't that a quality of life as well? That he still had a quality of life?
Right.
If it hadn't came out as well, he may have felt different. The quality of life wasn't there.
Exactly, right? So he looks pretty happy there, right? I don't know how he would rate his own health, but maybe he's just mugging for the camera, but he looks like he's happy. It sounds like he at least had some cognition that returned. He wasn't completely cognitively impaired afterwards. It could have gone another way. We don't know. We can't predict that. We can't guess. And so you have to think about, how much of a gambler am I? How do I feel about those options? And quality of life certainly is important, but it's certainly not guaranteed and stuff in these kind of situations. Good. Other thoughts about Mr. DeBakey, Dr. DeBakey? Yes.
I just had a question. Is he still living, or is he deceased? How long did he live after this?
I think he lived, I don't remember exactly. I think it was about 2 years. I think he lived to be like 99 before he died. Yeah. And I don't think he gave any more lecture, those sorts of things afterwards. But I don't think he was like frequently hospitalized or in a nursing home or any of those sorts of other issues. Good. Other questions or thoughts? I think it's a really interesting dilemma. Because we have technology and medical advances, doesn't always mean it's right to use them. And trying to figure out when it's right, when to be really aggressive, and when to back down, I think is a real challenge.
Is there any literature on, socioeconomic situations?
Yes.
And, how those decisions, if he wasn't a man of means,
Right.
had that, and then guess what? He would have ended up in a nursing home
Yes.
with no one to help him.
Yes, absolutely, 100% right. He had the resources that he probably had the nursing home brought to him, basically, if he needed it, right? And he was Dr. DeBakey at Dr. DeBakey's hospital, a hospital named after him. So I'm pretty sure he got great care. And we should all get great care. That shouldn't be any determining factor, but I suspect I think it does. It should not, but I think it does for sure. Yes, there are some literature looking at why people choose aggressive versus non-aggressive. Finances absolutely come into play in that situation. People who have less means recognize this is going to be a huge financial burden on my family, and I don't want it. Finances definitely come into play with that. And then the availability, as you point out, of resources afterwards. Like, okay, well, if I need a personal care aide 24/7, 3 different shifts worth of them, I can hire that. But not everybody can afford to do that. Yeah. So big range based on sociodemographic characteristics. So how you see the DeBakey story is really just, it probably resonates a little bit around what your own value set is, around whether people, if this outcome is a good outcome and a positive thing, and we should encourage more 97-year-olds to go for it, or whether this is like, well, that's great for him, but actually, I hope that story never gets told too loudly. People are going to want this surgery when they really probably shouldn't at 97. What about 99? What about 116? Where does it go? Where do we end? Exactly right. There is no number, and as we already talked about, there's so much heterogeneity in the aging process that 99 for Dr. DeBakey, he was brighter than I ever was at 25. He was really pretty vigorous, and that's not going to be the case for everybody. Okay. So back to the ecology of aging. So we think that aging and dying are important aspects of both human and global ecology. This is part of what every individual goes through in our world. Every plant, every animal, and every person will ultimately grow old and die if you're lucky enough. And we should embrace this better. I think the prevention of premature death is important. That's valuable. So it's a worthy goal for public health and acute care medicine to prevent premature death. The compression of morbidity. So if we're going to live long, to try and push off as long as possible functional debility, functional impairment. That's a good goal for gerontology, studying the aging process and trying to figure out how can we stay as active and independent and vital for as long as possible. And then thinking about how we function in the environment, thinking about our quality of life and relief of suffering. That's what geriatricians try to do. We really try and think about this very globally and focus mostly on individual values and goals and their quality of life. So depending on how you see the DeBakey story and this whole discussion about aging and the value of aging, you might say that maybe we got to take aging out of the purview of the healthcare field. Let's stop making it a medical disease. Let's give it back to the poets and talk about the dawning of the light and the dying of the embers and that sort of thing. Or maybe just find a doctor who has the soul of a poet who's going to treat you that way. I think that we need to reclaim the end of life as partly of what makes us fully human. So I'll end with my favorite poem. It's by Dylan Thomas. Do not go gentle into that good night. I'm sure many of you know this. It's a very famous poem. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning. they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight and learned too late they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death who see with blinding sight. Blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my Father, there on this sad height, curse, bless me now. With your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. I think it's just a beautiful poem. Good. So I wanted to, one of my colleagues, Rebecca Elon, is writing a book on this subject matter of aging and its environmental, the battle with environment, and gave me a lot of information to base my slides on. So look out for that eventually. And I wanted to make sure that I give her credit. That is it. Thank you.
Okay, well, I want to thank Dr. Christopher.
Thank you all.
Excellent, excellent, very